Dave, I've long thought that there are sort of two basic ways a person can go about the world as you're interacting with other people, watching what's going on around you, watching what has gone on in the past, judging the past. And those two ways can be sort of simplified in this way. One way is to focus on the good, to see what people do that is good, that's noble, that's impressive, that's praiseworthy, and put your attention on that. And the other is to focus on the bad.
Sure.
Really paying attention anytime someone screws up, messes up. I think this really resonates, these two ways of looking at the world probably resonates with all of our listeners who have kids. Because when you have children, little kids are trying to figure out how to live. They're trying to figure out how to talk, how to walk, how to use the potty, right? Just do really basic things. And it can be frustrating because sometimes, for weeks, months, your kid's not doing what you want him to do. And so that first time that your little boy walks across the room or your little girl uses the potty, right? You celebrate, woo, this is great. There's this natural proclivity to focus on the good.
Is it unfair for me to say I can relate with training my dog? I mean, that's about the closest experience, but it's the same thing.
It is the same thing, right? The puppy pees on the floor,
right,
over and over and over and over, and you're trying to train it, go outside. And when the first time happens, when the puppy actually barks and lets you know I need to go outside, it's this great moment, and it's a reason to celebrate. And we at the Vino Veritas Society, we're an optimistic group. We think that's a pretty healthy, wonderful way to go about the world. And the challenge is right now, as of right now, this is going to change, but as of right now, the Vino Veritas Society way of going about the world is not the dominant way.
Right.
The dominant way is the progressive way, because progressivism has crept into virtually every aspect of our lives, all of our institutions. And the progressive way is to focus on the bad.
Right.
We see this manifested in all kinds of ways, including progressives responding and reacting to things going on in the world right now, as well as things that happened a long time ago. Maybe one of the most prominent historical examples, when progressives look through American history, these Americans did amazing things. They did unprecedented. Not only did they do good, they did good. They advanced good. They did unprecedented kinds of good. They created this constitutional self-governing republic, the likes of which had never existed. I've been studying constitutions my whole adult, intellectual academic career. There is no constitution in the history of the world like the United States Constitution. And I would argue there's no constitution as wisely designed as ours. They did that. And along the way, as they were creating that, they enshrined the concept of property, private property, into our laws. And that protection of private property fuels this immense expansion in creativity and entrepreneurship and all these wonderful things. Along the way, they got rid of the idea of kingship, of monarchy. There's actually a passage in the Constitution that forever prohibits titles of nobility.
Sure.
It says here in the United States, we're not going to have barons and dukes and lords and lieges, none of that. We're citizens. That's it. We're citizens. Those Americans created the first regime of genuine religious liberty, not just religious toleration, where one majority religious sect, temporarily tolerates some other groups doing their thing. No, real religious liberty. I know you're a fan of Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island.
Right.
And what he makes clear in that letter is you are citizens, you are equal citizens with the same natural rights as all other citizens. You practice your faith every way you want to practice it. You have a full natural right to do that. That's not someone indulging you or tolerating you or giving you permission. You have the right to do that. No one else has the right to stop you from it.
Which had never, ever, ever happened before in the history of the world.
That's right.
You go back, before the United States, the best life of the last 2,000 years for the Jews was probably in the France-Germany area pre and during Napoleon.
Right.
And even that, you were tolerated. You weren't accepted as an equal. You weren't accepted as a full citizen and as having rights to property and everything else. But you were tolerated. You were allowed to go to school. You were allowed to become educated, to read a book, to practice your faith.
And it was a precarious scenario because at any moment, if the regime, if the king decided to revoke some of those tolerances, or he could. He had that power. He had that legal authority.
And quite often did.
My teacher, Harry Jaffa, who was Jewish, he loved to say this. He would always point to that letter, and he would say, the first time in all of human history that the chief executive officer of a government welcomed a group of Jews as full and equal citizens, having the exact same civil rights, natural rights as that chief executive himself. That had never happened before. And, we're talking about, these are all big accomplishments, achievements that the founders did. And we haven't even mentioned the biggest. The biggest one of all is as they thought about their own principles that they enshrined in their Declaration of Independence, and as they thought about those ideas and they thought and reflected on the world around them, they came to realize this institution of slavery right there where they lived, including many individuals who were writing and adopting these ideas of liberty were themselves slave owners, and they realized the ideas are true, they're good, and therefore this practice of slavery, this is a problem.
Right. We
got to get rid of it. And by golly, they did get rid of it in pretty short order, within 2 generations after the founding. Well, Lincoln, his sort of Shakespearean way of dating it, 77 years, the Americans get rid of legalized slavery. What I just described is a way of looking at and emphasizing the good. Those people weren't perfect. None of them were perfect. Many of them, both in their public and political capacities, as well as in their private lives, did stupid things, did dishonest things. Right. They're human beings. You're going to find injustice and corruption and stupidity right wherever you find human beings. In a way, if you focus on the bad, it's not a very interesting story, because if you really focus on the bad, with any group of people anywhere, you're going to find vice, viciousness, cowardice, deceit, and lies. I mean, you're always going to find that with human beings. And yet, that's not the progressive way of looking at the founding, not by focusing on those achievements. They look at that and say, blacks did not instantly have full civil rights and equal protection laws. Shame on those founders, shame on those Americans. They did too little good too slowly. They didn't act decisively. They didn't act quickly enough. Women didn't enjoy all the same civil rights as men did. They tend to focus on the bad to the point they'll go so far as to try to redate the American founding, right? They'll say, well, 1776 doesn't really matter, that statement of ideas. What really matters was 1619, the year the first slaves arrive, African slaves arrive in North America, because that characterizes everything that America becomes. And one of the reasons they want to do this, they want to dismiss and discredit everything. They want to say they didn't do what was right here on this one subject. Therefore, ergo, we should discredit everything that they did, discredit the entire regime, discredit all their work. Not only is it unfair to discredit everything, they're not even right when they say they didn't do something good. When you look at the founders, and if you judge the founding generation of Americans by the standard of angels or, perfection, right, they fall short. They were not angels. Who is?
Well, let's dig into that just a little bit before you move forward on that.
Well, let me make the second part. If you compare the founders to any other group of people, real people around the entire globe over the course of 6,000 years of human history, what the Americans did is pretty damn impressive.
Sure.
A lot of good.
You say that the founders weren't angels, right? We know that. The founders understood something that the progressives are also trying to change. One of the big battles that we've talked about in the past between the sort of the classical liberal American founding sense of people versus the progressive idea of people is whether or not human nature stays consistent or human nature changes and human nature evolves. The founders knew that people weren't perfect. The founders knew that in human nature, there are people who do a lot of good things, and we're not all perfect beings. None of us are. It's impossible. If we were perfect beings, we would be what Aristotle described as the god, the person who is purely reasoned and has no instincts, has no appetites, doesn't think about anything. No temptations.
Yeah.
And that's not human. And here's what's really interesting about what the founders did. The founders knew that about people. They knew we are not angels. We are not all beasts. We're not pure reason. We're not pure appetite, but we have this ability. And we've talked about that. But at the same time, that very last line of the Declaration, they had, we just did the podcast, it was, I think, 32, on the Freedom Trust.
Right.
They pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor.
Yes, they
and
did.
they said to each other, I know you're not perfect, but this cause that we come together for today, that 56 of us are signing, this is worth me trusting you. And we're going to trust each other because even though you're not perfect, you're working towards something so good that I'm going to trust my life to you.
You know, and it makes their trust, their freedom trust, as I like to call it, even more impressive in this sense. It should be pretty easy to trust an angel, right? If you actually know that a being is an angel or God, perfect.
Right.
Perfection, moral perfection. Well, it's pretty easy to trust that because it's perfect.
Right.
There's no risk involved. What's really gritty and difficult is trusting a real live human being, warts and all, faults and all, knowing even if someone has done some good things, they might do some really bad things in the future, and you got to decide, am I going to offer this trust or not? They did. They trusted each other with everything, their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor, even though they were all very flawed. They were very human. They were very human.
And they knew that about each other.
Yes.
They recognized, we're not perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. But we have a greater cause here.
And there's another, you use that word. That word perfect it's an important word in the development of modern philosophy, going all the way back to thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This idea starts to percolate and then becomes more prominent especially among American progressives, that human nature is perfectible. So go back to the founders. Not only did they say human beings are not perfect, they also argued they're not perfectible. They can't be made perfect.
Sure.
They're never going to be perfect. And so when you think about things like government and power, realize whoever has power is going to be a human being, and they're never going to be perfect.
Government is still people.
Yes, still people.
Government is not some group of angels who we've sifted through all of the 350 million people in the United States, and we've said, okay, this person's an angel, and that person's an angel, and that person's an angel. They're going to go be our government. They're just people. We're
people.
just choosing from amongst ourselves.
And they will always have, as human beings, they're always going to have their own self-interest.
Right.
And their own self-interest, what they want, what they value themselves, very often will be in conflict with what is good for others, with what is the public good. Sometimes it'll be in conflict with their own official position in the government. What they're supposed to do in government is in violation with their self-interest, and they often will choose to satisfy their own self-interest, benefit somehow personally by using the power of government rather than actually securing the rights of others.
Because that's their animal instinct inside of it. We are animals, and our default, to a point, our default mode is to be like other animals. Satisfy your temptations, satisfy your appetites, your instincts. My instinct tells me to go do this. And it's funny because I never really thought about it until recently, that how often I've heard from the guys on TV, the motivational speakers, things like that, who get on there and say, trust your instincts.
Right.
Follow your instincts, trust your gut. And our gut is quite often intended to satisfy something inside of us at the expense of what's right, at the expense of what's good, at the expense of what's reasonable and just and moral. And we don't do that.
If that animal part of us, right, is feeling hungry, well, your instinct might say, go kill that person standing on the street and eat them because you're hungry. That's what happens in the animal kingdom,
Sure.
right? There's this great, this great theme in modern society of following the animal part of our instinctual part. Well, that's part of natural instinct. Kill and eat others.
Sure.
And yet to be civilized human beings, we have to say, no, I am hungry, but I'm not going to kill and eat that person because that would be morally wrong. So there's that view, that foundational premise of human nature, that human beings are not perfect and they're not perfectible. They can never become perfect. Along comes the progressive movement, a century and a half after the American founding, and those progressives are seduced by, they're enthralled, but to a degree they're obsessed with this new philosophic idea that human nature is perfectible.
Right.
Even if human beings in the past were not perfect, we can make them perfect. Give us enough time, give us enough resources. This really informs
Give us enough power.
Enough power. Because we have to engage in some social engineering.
Yep.
We're going to have to create lots of institutions and structures and processes to guide the evolution of human nature into something better than it has been. This really is the central theme through the scholarship of a thinker like John Dewey, who is he's really the father of modern education, the schools of education. I don't mean all schools are educational. I mean the actual departments of education,
right,
where you go to learn to be a teacher, to be certified, a credentialed educator.
And for those who are curious, yes, that is the Dewey Decimal System. That is where that came from.
And that's his main theme, that these institutions, especially educational institutions, can transform human nature and perfect what used to be imperfect. And so I think this feeds into the modern progressive view of complete intolerance for anything less than perfect.
Okay.
Anything less than perfect. So the founders did not achieve full, perfect justice instantly.
Right.
Therefore, we should discredit everything they did. Now, there's this other fascinating wrinkle, in a way, a great irony in that progressive emphasis on what is bad, what is less than perfect. To judge what is not perfect, to judge, say, how the founding fathers or the revolutionaries fell short, you have to have some standard. You got to say they fell short of what? What were they supposed to be doing? What was their goal of which they fell short? And it turns out the goal are the very ideas enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. There's the great irony. The first group of people in human history to identify that beautiful concept of natural human equality, enshrine it in their Declaration of Independence, make it the moral foundation of their regime. Later generations of Americans point back at their work, and rather than celebrating that, they say, shame on you, we reject you, we're canceling you, because you didn't fully live up to the principles you described for the first time in human history.
Right. And what's funny is you've talked about this quite a bit offline. You've talked about this in meetings and in some of our toolbox videos. The idea that Woodrow Wilson actually had a really solid grasp on the ideas of the Declaration. His argument wasn't that the idea was wrong. I think this is the point you were just making. His argument wasn't that the idea of the total idea of liberty and freedom and human happiness and flourishing is wrong. He's just saying that the way that the founders went about achieving it was wrong. And that's really what the progressive movement spawned out of, that they needed more people out there to be able to tell people, you're not doing this right. You have to you have to trust us to do it for you because you don't know how. It's not that we don't want everybody to be flourishing and happy. It's you're just not capable. You're not smart enough.
Well, and I was to say there's kind of a mixed bag within that, especially among the literature from the early generation of progressives. We keep going back to this because it's so critical, that moment in time, the 1870s, 1880s, after that period, right after the Civil War, you had some progressives. They looked at the ideas of the Declaration of Independence as kind of goals to reach.
Sure.
And thought most people are too stupid, too corrupt, too incapable to reach them on their own. Therefore, we need a class of experts to basically make their decisions for them to help them achieve those goals. Then you had other progressives who outright rejected that idea of, like, say, a natural right to liberty. They said, no, that's foolish. Lots of people do not have a natural right to their own liberty,
Sure.
because they haven't evolved enough. They haven't become perfected enough. They haven't acquired that natural right. Therefore, we, the intellectual class, we, the progressive class, we have rightful authority to control their lives, to tell them how to live, where they're going to work, basically every detail of their lives.
And what ends up happening is you have all these people saying, okay, so if you want these rights, if you want to achieve these, you have to accomplish certain things. You have to earn them. You have to be a certain level of have a certain level of education. You have to accomplish certain things, and that's where you start to get that right.
And most importantly, you got to be progressive.
Right.
You got to. If you go get the degrees and you're really smart and you're really fancy, and you don't agree with us progressives, then that by itself is a sign, is a symptom. You're not perfected. You're not evolved.
Well, think about the dissertation model for a PhD education, right? Mm-hmm. You did it. You have to provide this dissertation, and this mostly subjective committee gets to say, okay, you're perfected enough, or no, you're not, right? I mean, they built this in a way that was totally subjective so that they could have control. The problem that arose out of all of this is what happens when you start getting those people who like the founding, those people who want to save and believe in freedom and believe in what the founders targeted. What happens when they start getting PhDs? And once they do, they start sitting on committees for other people who do.
You become Cranwitter. You become a thorn in their side, right? Because you have the academic credential, but you're not scorning and ridiculing the founders. You're a student of the founders. You want to learn from them because you think they did something good. And this progressive emphasis on the bad, looking and focusing, making everything about the failures rather than the successes. It is now reverberating around within modern culture today. It has given rise to, I think it's a pretty accurate label to call it this cancel culture, and it includes many really talented people, some wonderful, fine people, not perfect, not angels, but people who do a lot of good things. They do one thing that the progressive class disapproves of, and immediately they should be canceled. They should be. I feel stupid because I can't remember her name. There's an actress who was just kicked off of one of the Star Wars series here recently.
I don't know her name, but I know the story.
And she reposted. She didn't even write anything herself. She reposted a little meme comparing the Nazi fanaticism to the kind of political hatred we see in the United States today, and the progressive class that is intolerable. Can't have that. Immediately she's kicked off.
But here's the problem. One of her co-stars on the same show posted something almost identical, comparing Nazi fanaticism to Trump fanaticism. Only 6 months ago.
Right.
And he was heralded.
Right.
He was a hero. Keep fighting that progressive fight.
Yep. And there we see the little chink in the armor of cancel culture, right? They're not consistent at all. This turns out to be a highly politically charged, partisan kind of endeavor. We lost a real national treasure here within the last week. We lost Rush Limbaugh, and everyone kind of knew it was coming. He's been struggling with cancer, and he made that known. He was quite open and public about it. And it was amazing to see what happened immediately. I mean, within moments of the news getting out there, the progressives focusing on the bad, right? Going back decades. And when the whole AIDS thing first came out, and I remember when that was happening, 1984, 1985, he made some jokes about homosexuals. He did. He made some jokes. And later, he apologized in a very sincere way. He said, that was wrong of me. He didn't realize the extent of this sickness, this disease. He said, I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Doesn't matter. He made those jokes, and so progressives want to say, therefore he is a bad man, and everything he ever said or did should be ignored. And the truth is, Rush, to his credit, I feel like we're talking about the founders, right? Very imperfect in all kinds of ways, imperfect as a public spokesperson, imperfect in his private life.
Sure.
And I think it's quite debatable and defensible that Rush Limbaugh probably did more in the last generation. I'm brainstorming here as I'm about to say this. I think than anyone else to communicate the basic, essential ideas of the founding, the basic ideas of constitutional government and individual liberty and free markets and innovation and prosperity, wealth creation. He probably did more than any other human being to broadcast that message, not just to some, but to a gigantic audience, millions and millions of people. I can't think of anyone who has taught those good ideas to such a large number of people in the last generation.
I mean, it's almost comparable, and there's two aspects to it. On the one hand, not only did he communicate all of those things, but he taught other people how to communicate those things.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And he inspired people to go learn more. He inspired people to go explore more. And he inspired more people to try to be like him in the good ways, right? He didn't go out and say, okay, if you're going to go espouse the ideas of the founding, you also have to go make jokes about being gay and having AIDS. Mm-hmm. He just said that was a mistake and that was something I shouldn't have done, but you need to go learn more about the founding. And he inspired a lot of people to go out and take that same path. In a sense, he did something that, I mean, remember, you've talked about this, I've talked about this. There was no conservative talk radio before Rush Limbaugh. I mean, he was really the first to take that to a large scale. There were small.
In fact, I want to make that point stronger. There was no non-progressive, set aside conservative, just no non-progressive voice on the national media of any kind, TV, radio, anything. And this is a problem. I think some people know this, some people might not know this whole story of the total progressive control of the media that stretches all the way back to World War II, to the New Deal period in Franklin Roosevelt, when New Dealers in Congress, they created the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and through it, they delegated power to the FCC to enforce the fairness doctrine.
Right.
And so the way it worked, the FCC, if you were going to broadcast on a radio station, you had to be licensed. It was a crime.
Just like everything else.
Just like everything else, right? It was a federal crime to transmit a radio signal without a license from the federal government. So you have to have your FCC license, and then to keep that license, they came in and said, we are enforcing the fairness doctrine. So if you have anybody on your show for 2 hours talking about political things, especially non-liberal, non-progressive, non-New Deal things, then you have to give equal airtime to the opposite view. Mm-hmm. And for most radio stations, they said, well, that's going to eat up our whole day. That's most of our daytime air. So they just chose to stay away from it. This really gives the rise to music radio. Sure. We'll just play music we think people like because if we start talking about serious issues, the FCC is going to now come in and control our whole format with this big exception. You run a radio station, you're broadcasting content, you have your FCC license, you want to keep it. The president, Franklin Roosevelt, is giving a fireside speech. The FCC comes along and says, you must broadcast that because that's public information. Right. That is what is it called? A public service announcement.
Right. PSAs.
PSA. And there were conservative radio station owners pushing back saying, wait. That's total partisan crap. That's a bunch of big government, right? Progressive New Deal stuff. And they said, no, that's not partisan. That's not political. That's the president of the United States, and he's president of the whole United States, of all citizens. So that's just a public service. You must broadcast that, but if you broadcast anything critical of Roosevelt or the New Deal, we're going to come in and basically control your format. That was in place throughout the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all the way until 1987, Congress finally repeals the Fairness Doctrine. And in less than a year, Rush Limbaugh is talking on the radio and talk radio takes off. So it's a real lesson in what in progressive control, right? How they want to control everything, including what we hear, the arguments and the ideas that come through. And Rush Limbaugh blazed an entirely new path, saying, "I am here. You may not always agree with me, but I'm here to offer a counter to the whole progressive narrative that's on all the nightly news shows, that's on radio stations across. I'm going to do something different and outside the box."
I'm going to make a comparison that Rush Limbaugh, a little shout out to one of our chapters here in Colorado, chapter number 3. He's a modern Harriet Beecher Stowe.
That's a great point.
He is a modern, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she gets that into 300,000 homes?
It was first published, before it became a book, it was a series in Harper's Weekly,
right?
Which progressives are going to hate me for saying this, but it was true. It was a women's magazine. It was a magazine tailored to women. Can you think of the audacity of this? And you used to be in the magazine business, so this resonates with you too. Editors and writers in a magazine assumed there were certain topics women wanted to hear about, and so they designed this magazine for women, and she's publishing these. It's a series of stories that later becomes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin,
right.
Really revealing the horrors that happen on a plantation, what plantation life was really like for slaves. And what Harriet Beecher Stowe does, that is, I argue this in my book, Vindicating Lincoln, she, as much as Lincoln, causes the Civil War indirectly because she gets the attention of women. And up until her series and then her book, millions of women in the United States were just kind of tuned out. They weren't paying attention to the fight over slavery. They didn't really care. And then they start reading these stories. And what makes Uncle Tom's Cabin so gripping is it's very personalized. You get to know these characters, who they are and their personality, right? And you see these terrible things happening. And so all of a sudden you have millions of women across the United States. Their husband comes home right in the evening, and the wife wants to know, what are you going to do to get rid of this problem of slavery?
This is a tangent, and I know we didn't intend to go down this tangent, but this is a really interesting conversation. Women didn't have the right to vote yet. We hadn't gone through the women's suffrage movement.
They actually had, this is a great story,
Okay.
going all the way back to the 1790s,
Okay.
New Jersey created universal suffrage. Men and women were voting.
Okay.
And within 3 or 4 election cycles, the women of New Jersey voted on a measure to repeal women's suffrage. I want to repeat this.
Okay.
Women turned out to vote, and they did vote for a measure to take away the right of women to vote. And their argument at that time was that women voting was injecting politics into the home, and they thought it was bad for their marriages. They thought it was bad for their home life. They chose to disenfranchised women from voting. But everywhere else, you're right. But for the most part, women were not voting.
But it shows that there's this part of the progressive cancel culture is those founders only cared about what men had to think, only cared about what white men had to think. And that's why they were only allowed, it was all men are created equal. And they refused to acknowledge that men meant human beings. And
right.
You go through this whole thing, and I'm sitting there thinking, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this in Harper's magazine. And is influencing women. She's talking to women. And these women, how much power did they have in the home? How much influence did they have in their home that they got these men?
Enormous is the answer.
No man. I honestly, I promise you this. And for any woman out there who doesn't believe me,
you're treading on dangerous grounds right now.
No man actually says, no sane man, I'm going to put it that way, actually says, I want to go to war. I want to go kill as many people as I possibly can, right? They will when they feel it's appropriate, when they feel it's necessary. When something like 9/11 happens, some men say
they feel it's their duty.
I feel
their
I have a
obligation.
duty to my country, to my neighbors, to my community, to my family,
Yeah.
to go fight on behalf of this country.
Yep.
But I would be happier if we weren't at war.
Yeah.
I would be happy if everybody got along, and no man wants to go, and especially a civil war. No man in America at that time, no sane man in America at that time was sitting there saying, man, I just want to go kill as many Southern Americans or Northern Americans as I possibly can. Those guys I just want to go murder people.
Right.
That's not sanity. That's not clarity of thought. And these women didn't need the right to vote, didn't need anything else to have influence over their husbands, over their older sons, to say, this is wrong, and you're going to go do something about it.
And in case anybody listening right now tries to dismiss or downplay what you're saying, your point was repeated by no less a figure than Abraham Lincoln, Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States, who gets us into the Civil War, leads us through the Civil War. He met Harriet Beecher Stowe. And when he met her, she was a very small, petite woman, and there's Abe at 6'5", 6'6", and he bends down, he gives her a big hug, and he says, "So you're the little lady who started this war."
Right.
And I think he was being, a little ironic, but he was also being quite literal in a certain way. You brought the injustice of slavery to the attention of millions of Americans, especially millions of women, who they didn't fully understand what life was like on Southern plantations. And they became infuriated as they appalled when they learned about it.
She was doing that to inspire people, to make people aspire to something greater, to the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't I'm going to go fight for a politician. I'm going to go fight for women's suffrage or anything like that. I'm going to go do this through political means. No, I'm going to go change minds. I'm going to go change the culture. And you know what's really interesting about that? As you tell that story, my immediate reaction is there's a lot of similarities between that and the actual writing of the Declaration of Independence. And I say that in terms of how it inspired people to go take action, right? We've talked at length in Toolbox videos and here about how when the Revolutionary War first started, it was scary. There were a lot of 18 to 20-year-old young men who were going out on these battlefields against the most powerful army in the history of the world. And those redcoats start marching towards you, and you hear the drums. You have to check your pants, and you go turn and you run.
Well, and let me add here, we'll do a little shout out to one of our good friends, Bob Schaefer.
Sure.
You and I have both heard Bob Schaefer. He's the genius behind Liberty Common School up in Fort Collins, and he has memorized Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, the whole speech, and he does this very dramatic reenactment of it. It's a wonderful thing. If anyone ever has an opportunity to see it, I hope they can. And who's Patrick responding to in that speech? A bunch of hardened, serious men who are saying, let's wait, let's not pick up guns, and let's not fight against the British. They've done many bad things, but we're not there yet. We shouldn't cross that line. Patrick Henry's whole speech is to say, no, this is the time right now.
Right.
Because they are amassing an army all around us. We're not in a very position of strategic advantage right now. And every day that goes on, it's going to get worse and worse for us. If we're going to stand up for ourselves and fight, we got to stand up and fight right now.
Right. And as part of that, I mean, people forget that the revolution didn't start when we signed the Declaration of Independence. There were battles happening back in 1775, and there were even issues and questions coming up a decade or two before then. We get through this whole process, and it wasn't until the Declaration was signed and people looked at it and said, okay, I know what we're fighting for. And yes, we're not perfect people. We're not perfect human beings, but what King George is doing, it's not right. And we need to step up and we need to do something about it. And it gave people that idea of this is what the world could be. This is what our country could be, what our colonies could be. And in many of the same ways, what Harriet Beecher Stowe did with Uncle Tom's Cabin in that series of articles, did the same thing.
Now, let me put a little wrinkle in this. You were comparing Harriet Beecher Stowe and Rush Limbaugh, and I think the comparison is very apt. It's very appropriate. Imagine if we discovered today, some historical researcher discovered that in a private letter, Harriet Beecher Stowe mocked homosexuals.
That's the point.
What would progressives do with that? This is the woman. This is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is the mind that put a spotlight on the horrors of slavery and helped mobilize and inspire and move to action millions of Americans to go do the right thing, to get rid of this terrible institution. And my hunch is, of course, I never met Harriet Beecher Stowe. She lived a long time ago. I'm pretty confident she wasn't perfect.
Right.
I bet she said or did some ugly things at one time or another in her life.
According to the progressive model for what perfection looks like today, and obviously that changes every day. They find one new thing to make people that people need to step towards to be closer and closer to perfect. You never actually reach that under the progressive model. But according to just the progressive idea today, she isn't perfect because she wasn't out advocating for women's suffrage at the time. She was living, talking to women. She was saying, this is who I want to talk to. I'm going to single out a group. I'm not going to talk to men. Men, you're not going to understand this. Men, you're not going to relate to this. I'm going to write it in a way that relates to a certain mentality. And that's not very progressive.
And focuses on a certain problem.
Right.
If we could get, this is one of my dreams, Dave. I haven't shared this with you, but I'm going to share it here in the midst of our podcast. One of my dreams is we're going to have a third chair right here, and I would love to have AOC in one of our podcasts because I have lots of questions for her.
Sure.
And I'm hoping, I'm so confident in our persuasive skills that you and I might be able to inspire her with a few ideas of freedom. But imagine we had AOC sitting right here with us, and we said, okay, Miss Ocasio-Cortez, you have developed this whole blueprint for a new Green Deal. Why isn't it law? Why isn't that enacted? Shame on you. What have you been doing? And she would say, well, hold on. These things are hard to get done, right? She would start explaining the great challenges of accomplishing some political object, including an object she thinks is good. She thinks that is a good, noble end. And yet, when progressives turn to the past, they immediately seem to forget that.
Right.
That's hard work to achieve some big political goal. You know, it's hard to improve something in your own personal life.
Sure.
Think of how hard. You say you have a bad habit. You smoke too much, you drink too much, you eat too much, and you get to, you come to the realization, I really got to clean up my act. I got to stop doing this stuff. That's hard. And there's no other person out there actively resisting you. That's just you trying to change your own habits. Sure. That's hard. Imagine if you want to accomplish something that requires cooperation and support from lots of other people, requires lots of votes, requires lots of other agreement. It takes time. It's work. It's very difficult to get these things done. And we should never forget the easiest thing to do always is nothing. Just be apathetic.
Right.
Don't fight to change anything. You know, when progressives look at the earlier generations of Americans and they compare them to angels and say, oh, they fell short. I look at earlier generations of Americans and I compare them to total apathy. Because most people throughout most of history have been really apathetic. They didn't do much. Why were slaves in ancient Greece? Why did they stay in slavery so long? What was wrong with those lazy bums, right? Why didn't they revolutionize and get rid of slavery instantly? It lasted for century after century after century, right? Because most people are kind of apathetic. It's easier to do nothing. And these Americans, they chose not to do nothing. They chose to do something. And in fact, they did a whole lot.
And that's part of our instincts and appetites and everything else, right? Do you want to go take on something that has a potential to do a lot of harm, a lot of damage to you personally in the name of something good, in the name of something reasonable, in the name of something that is going to benefit probably others more than yourself?
Right.
Or do you want to just take care of yourself? And then there's also that one other really important word, and that's fear.
Yeah.
Right? And this goes back to that image I just painted of Washington's troops seeing those redcoats coming, hearing those drum beats and getting scared and turning and running away.
Many years ago, I was out in Claremont, California, and I was part of a think tank out there called the Claremont Institute. I was part of the crew who launched the Claremont Review of Books. We had a big project, and I was part of it. I was working out. We were reviewing textbooks. We had this crazy idea at the time. Maybe we would get in the textbook industry. We had this ambition. We'll go write our own textbooks.
Sure.
And then we quickly discovered that progressives have total control of that whole industry of how the textbooks are designed and written and funneled right into the public school districts, and there's this great marriage between them. Anyway, one of the things I was responsible for was reviewing textbooks. I mean, what's out there? Are they really bad? Are some of them good? How bad are they? So I was going through dozens and dozens of leading high school government and history textbooks. And I will never forget one. As I'm flipping through, there was one mention of George Washington in this textbook. And it had a picture of him up in the upper right-hand corner. And the caption said that George Washington was first president of the United States who owned slaves. That was the one factoid about George Washington. And I think that reflects the progressive view, right? We do know he owned some slaves, and therefore nothing else matters. Everything is discredited. Yet Washington himself is a fascinating figure that I've read. I know a lot about his life, and I've never been able to answer this question. When you think of the eve of the Revolutionary War, just before violence was going to break out, imagine you were George Washington. Washington, at that moment, in early months of 1775, so this is before Lexington and Concord even happened, he was one of, if not the wealthiest man in America. He had this huge estate, beautiful house, large grounds. He was well-to-do. He was known by George III and favored. George III had respect. George III knew who George Washington was because Washington had served in the French Indian War. And so Washington commanded a lot of respect by the British military and therefore by the British king. He had a very nice, comfortable life. The taxes that Parliament was imposing were a pittance compared to what we pay today. Right? It was a tiny little amount. George Washington could easily pay those taxes and live exactly the kind of life he wanted to live. Why does he choose instead to head up this ragtag Continental Army staffed with teenage boys, some of whom are unarmed? They show up and they don't have any weapons. And back then, this sounds crazy to progressives today, but most soldiers fought with their own personal weapons of war. They had their own. Many of the cannons they used were personally owned cannons that they would drag out on the battlefield.
They probably hand-built quite a few of them.
Exactly. And so when you look at that and you think, what was Washington thinking? This is, in many respects, this is irrational to go on this, what appeared to be a suicidal mission, right? We're going to go take on the British Army that is being transferred here by the British Navy. You don't want to go up again. And yet he did. He did. And if Washington had not made that choice, if he had decided to be apathetic and just say, hey, look, I'm fat and comfortable here at Mount Vernon, and that's a scary thing to go take on the British. I know what the British Army and Navy is. We can't beat them. I'm just going to stay home, guys, and do nothing. The entire course of history is different, and we would be much worse off for it. The United States wouldn't have been born. We wouldn't have this experiment in self-government.
And forget just the United States. The experience of certain groups of people would be much worse for it. If you look at what happened with the Atlantic slave trade after the Revolution, I mean, we stopped the Atlantic slave trade, and you and I have talked about these numbers. 12 million slaves transferred from Africa to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere. 450,000 of those 12 million ended up on North American shores. Right? Where'd all those others go? the Caribbean islands,
Yep.
South America, as many as 10 million to Brazil alone.
Yep.
If he had never fought that war, how many more slaves would have come into to this country? And I want to bring up one other example that I think is just the other perfect example of that actually isn't an American story. It's a British story, and that's Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had to make a similar decision in World War II, right? He's sitting there and he's looking, and the Battle of Britain's happening above their head, and there's cannons, and the Nazis are dropping bombs on London.
Yep.
And he has to make an awful decision. Do I continue to just try to fight the Nazis, who are a stronger army than we are, who have more capabilities than the British have? Or do I go make a deal with Joseph Stalin?
Ah, right. Yes.
Do I go this other guy who's really a bad person, and I know he's really a bad person?
He not only makes fun of homosexuals, he does far worse things.
He beheads them. He kills them.
Really ugly, bad things.
Them.
Yep.
And he had to look at him and say, we could forever become a Nazi regime, part of a Nazi regime. We could watch the Nazis take over the world, watch this group of socialists who kill everybody who doesn't have blonde hair and blue eyes. Or I can go make this arrangement with this other really bad person.
This other lunatic.
Who's
offering to kill Germans.
Right.
He'll attack Germany. He'll kill Germans.
And he does. And they defeat the Nazis. And I think any historian would agree, if he didn't do that, if the Nazis didn't have to fight a two-front war, they would have won. I think there's very little doubt about that. And we would be living in a very, very, very different world. Well, you would be living in a very, very different world. I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, that's right. As a Jew, you likely wouldn't be here.
Right.
And I would be speaking German and doing the Heil Hitler sign or something like that. You emphasize this rightly so. What became Nazi Germany, the body of ideas that became Nazi Germany, that were put into practice, that body of ideas were the same ideas that the American progressives were studying. That's why they went to Germany. They literally went and studied at the University of Berlin and other German institutions in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s. And it was that body of social science that becomes the basis of Nazi Germany. And for those who they just assume, part of the progressive view today is education by definition is good. The more people who go to school, get these degrees, that makes the world better. Well, in the 1930s, Germany had more scientists, researchers, PhDs, medical doctors, nurses, accountants, lawyers. It was the most highly educated regime on planet Earth. And all that learning, all that expertise, all that technological prowess was channeled in the direction of injustice, mass murder, slaughter, terrible, horrible things. And the Germans were this close. They were at that time they were the most advanced in terms of rocket technology, and they could send a rocket up. They could get it to come back down. They could get it to blow up and do devastating. They weren't really good at. They couldn't get it. They couldn't target it very well, but they were close. They were really close to figuring out how to. If they had perfected that, England would have just become a crater in the North Atlantic. They would have blown it off the face of the planet, and that's how Hitler would have dealt with the problem of England. And so you're right. Churchill has this terrible, awful choice to make. And there's a guy he's a bad guy. Joseph Stalin is a bad man by every measurement. And he is offering assistance in this common effort to go defeat Hitler. And Churchill, the entire time, Churchill was very clear about this. He knew Stalin was a bad man. He knew it. And he knew that if they beat the Germans together as an allied force, as soon as that fight is over, the next problem will be Stalin. Stalin will be the next problem we'll have to deal with, however that looks like. And sure enough, we get the Cold War that rages for over half of a century after that. How would a progressive enamored with this idea of cancel culture, canceling anybody who says or does even trifling little things they think is wrong, What would they do if they were sitting in the war room with Winston Churchill as the bombs are raining down and buildings are blowing up and people are dying, and Churchill saying, I think we have to make an alliance with that bad man to get out of this situation?
They'd have gone straight to the media and tried to get him out of office.
Probably.
They'd have run a recall.
Yeah.
I want to do something to end today that we don't usually do, and that's a call to action. And I want our listeners to really think about this specific call to action, because there are people in this world, there are countries, there are organizations, there are people throughout the world, both here at home in the United States and abroad, who still think in similar terms to how the Nazis did, how the British did in the 1770s, that their way is the right way and everybody has to live that way. Mm-hmm. And truthfully, this is how the progressives do too. And when you look at your neighbors and when you talk to your friends and your neighbors, we have created some serious purity tests in all kinds of ways. And this isn't unique to any group of people. But if you don't agree exactly with the way we do, you're done. You're canceled. We're gonna and we're not gonna deal with you anymore. Remember that people are human. First call to action. Remember people are human. Remember that people aren't perfect. Find the common ground. Find the common goal, and that common goal is freedom. That common goal is liberty and is what is inscribed in the Declaration of Independence. It's that world that the Declaration aspires to. Go form the alliances, even though somebody's not perfect.
I'm going to add to that. Part of it's part of the same spirit. As you're looking around, the people around you and your neighbors, and including family members, right? Family's tough because you don't get to pick them. You don't get to pick who's in your family. As you're looking around these people and you're recognizing their basic humanity, focus on the good. Focus on their successes, on their achievements. I'm not saying ignore bad things people do. Don't ignore that, especially if it's dangerous. Don't ignore that. And it doesn't mean make excuses for every failure, every injustice, but appreciate the good. When somebody does something generous or something creative or something helpful, appreciate that. Let them know, I really appreciate it. Telling someone I appreciate that good thing you did, you're not saying you're an angel and I agree with everything you've ever said and done in your life. You're just saying you did that thing and you didn't have to, but you did it.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful. Thank you. I love you for that.
Right. And I think that's part of the American spirit. I think that's part of what the founders did when they wrote that last line of the Declaration and they signed it. They said, we're all in this together. And we do know that there's some good that's going to come out of this, and that good goes beyond any single one of us.
You know, Dave, if we keep at this, you and I are both interested in politics and history and philosophy. I think we're becoming therapists if we stick at this podcast long enough. We're helping people lead better lives.
It'll be interesting how many people could get their progressive friends and family to listen to some of the things we have to say. And we will continue to say it because we are the guardians.
Yes, we are. No sumos custodes.
See you next week.
All right.